Hey everybody, welcome to the program. This is The Other People Show, a weekly podcast featuring in-depth interviews with today's leading writers. I am Brad Listi, and I'm in Los Angeles. It's good to be with you. Appreciate you tuning in. Hope you're doing all right. Don't forget to subscribe to this show wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow the show on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. So today I have a bit of a special episode. I have two guests for the price of one. First of all, I will be in conversation with Alejandro Zambra, author of the story collection, My Documents.
Maybe when we talk about our work publicly, we are not that honest because we are always talking about subjects, about purposes. But what you really enjoy is that you have a plan and you sit in front of the computer and you get to the point where you don't know what you're doing. And it's like, okay, like you're playing the instrument, you're playing the guitar, so you are able to improvise. But there is a moment where you are really part of the instrument, and that is writing for me.
All right, that was Alejandro Zambra, author of the story collection My Documents. Alejandro and I were joined in conversation by Megan McDowell, his longtime translator and a winner of the National Book Award for Translation.
You know, I think when I first read Alejandro's work, I felt a connection to it. I felt like if I were a writer, this is the kind of thing I would want to write. You know, this kind of text that is deceptively simple, but that has layers that you can read over and over again and discover new things every time you read it. Sometimes I think the feeling of improvisation might come from a lot of work.
All right, that was Megan McDowell, translator of the story collection entitled My Documents by Alejandro Zambra. Megan McDowell and Alejandro Zambra have collaborated on multiple books. This edition of My Documents features 5 additional stories that address themes of religion, romance, technology, solitude, and more. This is a book about the dimensions of masculinity in Chile from the 1980s to the present. It is a testament to the necessity of literature, even and especially in times of political and personal crisis. My conversation with Alejandro Zambra and Megan McDowell is coming up in just a couple of minutes. Don't forget to subscribe to my weekly email newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. It is free, and you can join the Other People Patreon community over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Support the show, help keep it going into the future. If you would like to join the Otherppl Book Club, you can do so over at otherppl.com. You can also get an Other People t-shirt while you're there. So my guests are Alejandro Zambra and his translator, Megan McDowell. Again, the new story collection is called My Documents, available from Penguin Books. It is the official April pick of the book club. Alejandro Zambra is the author of 10 books, most recently Chilean Poet and Multiple Choice. He is the recipient of numerous literary prizes, as well as a New York Public Library Cullman Center Fellowship. He has published his work in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Paris Review, and Harper's, among other publications, and he lives in Mexico City. Megan McDowell is the winner of the 2022 National Book Award for Translation, and she is the recipient of the 2020 Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She has been nominated 4 times for the International Booker Prize. It is a real pleasure to have had the chance to speak with Alejandro Zambra and Megan McDowell together. This is a kind of episode that I have been meaning to do for a long time. I'm one of these people who believes that literary translators are unsung heroes in the book business, and I know that Alejandro agrees. So it was just a real treat and very fascinating to speak with a gifted author and his gifted translator together. And I'm excited to share the conversation with all of you right now. Here I am talking with Alejandro Zambra and Megan McDowell.
So I learned Spanish in Chile, and I was always interested in translation. When I started a master's program in translation in Texas, I came back to Chile for a few months with the specific idea of finding a project to translate in a workshop. And I asked around, and I asked a lot of people. I asked booksellers and editors and readers who the interesting younger writers in Chile were. And I went back to Texas with a big pile of books, and because everyone gave me a lot of suggestions, but they all coincided in Alejandro Zambra. And I read all those books and I agreed with them. And so I just wrote Alejandro and asked if I could translate his book, and I did it in a master's workshop. So I did it on my own. And then I did a reading of it at a translation conference. And one of the 2 people in the audience was Chad Post, who was the editor of Open Letter Press. And he liked it and ended up buying that translation. And that's how, this was not Bonsai, Alejandro's first book. It was The Private Lives of Trees. And so that book ended up being published in Open Letter, and then I've worked with Alejandro ever since. We actually didn't meet until we met in New York when we did an event for the launch of that book. And, since then, we've worked together on all of his books, and now we're really good friends, and we have a much more collaborative relationship. And, well, I think the past year I can say that I went back and translated Bonsai, so now I can say I have translated all of Alejandro's books. But he's the writer that I've worked with the most over my career, and we've kind of grown and developed as writers and translators together.
Well, it's a unique relationship creatively, is it not, Alejandro? To have your work translated means you have to really place your faith and trust in somebody to understand your meaning and to render it well. So, Alejandro, can you just talk a little bit about the relationship from your perspective? And, you speak wonderful English, but it's not your first language. And I can tell you, as somebody who is a native English speaker, that you're in very good hands. I'm sure you know that, but the work is beautifully translated, and that's got to be a great comfort to you when you're publishing in English in the States and elsewhere.
Well, I don't speak great English.
Yes, you do.
Well, but by my standards, you do.
No, I don't. My English, actually, I never studied English. My English comes from the exposure to Nirvana and Seinfeld and Emily Dickinson, so it's really weird. There are many very easy things I cannot say in English, and sometimes some complicated things I can say in English. It's really like weird, and there are some funny stories about it. But I think Megan is my voice in English. And I was really lucky in many senses to find a voice. You're right. I mean, it is English. Still, I don't speak the English I would like to speak. Still, English is my second language, and I like to think that literature is my second language. I like the idea that English is the no. I'm sorry. I like the idea that literature is the second language of people uh, uh, who don't speak a second language. Because I had a sense of the world by reading foreign literature, translated literature. As a kid, there were all these translated books from English, from German, from French. All the books I was reading when I was a kid were there explaining cultures, distant cultures, and for me, in a way, were totally different, and from a certain point of view, were the same. I was reading, I don't know, Chilean literature and Argentinian literature, but German literature and English literature without thinking too much about it. Japanese literature, and my whole idea of literature comes from that, from that disorder. So when I started publishing, to me the mere idea of being translated was crazy. I was writing for my people in Chilean Spanish. So I was lucky also of finding someone who fell in love with Chilean Spanish, you know, and from those first experiences with the private lives of trees, we started working together. But basically, we became friends with Megan. She says. We have a collaborative relationship, but I don't know what that means. I mean, she's great. Uh, we are friends, so we talk about her work, but it is her work.
But
And when I was living,
she could not do it without you, right? Let's
yeah,
be
but
honest.
there is this story I do like a lot. When I was living in New York in 2015, I lived there for a year with this fellowship from the New York Public Library. So I was invited 4 or 5 times to readings, in English. And the people who invited me obviously assumed I was going to read in English. But reading in this second language is totally different, you know? So I was like, what am I supposed to read? I mean, I like reading aloud my work, but in Spanish. So I was like, well, I have to choose a different excerpt. So I was writing to Megan, please, I'm going to read this in English. Please read it to me, record it to me. And I was listening to that and imitating her in order to get to the point where I could kind of master it and read that to the audience. I was basically imitating her.
Well, wait, Megan, do you get paid extra for that? I feel like that's not in your job
It's what
description.
you do for your friends.
I was going to say that's the bonus of being buddies, in addition to being professional collaborators. And as I listen to you guys talking, like a couple of things occur to me. First of all, this issue of like serendipity, but also showing up, and how the fortunes of a writer, the fortunes of any human being, often come down to one person. Just the fact that, Megan, you were looking for work to translate in Chile, and Alejandro's work was sort of the meeting point of all the different recommendations that you were getting, as you said. And then from there, you do a reading of it yourself. And this publisher is there who takes an interest in the work. I mean, it really turned on that single human exchange, right? It's really interesting to me on that level. And then the other part of it that I want to hear more about, because this is something that I think like gets into the weeds of translation at a level that Megan, I'm sure you will have something to say about, is this notion of studying abroad in Chile, learning Chilean Spanish, which is its own brand of Spanish, and having maybe an aptitude to translate Chilean literature as a result to a degree of proficiency that you might not have, say, if you were translating works by an author from Spain. Maybe, maybe not, but can you speak to like the specificity of Chilean Spanish and what it is about it that you respond so much to and what it requires of you as a translator?
Looking back on my life, I can impose a meaningful or sensible trajectory on it. But there is, you're right, a lot of, randomness and serendipity and a lot of it. Because I didn't really know what I was doing. I was a person who liked to read a lot. And I was interested in, I like to read translation. And, I never thought that I could be a translator. I thought, because I learned as an adult, I learned Spanish as an adult. And I didn't never take classes or anything like that. And I went to Chile basically because I wanted to live in a country that was not the United States. I was interested in Latin American literature, which to me back then was one thing. I didn't really know anything. And to me, I was really in love with Cortázar and Argentine literature. But I had a friend who lived in Chile for a minute and he convinced me to go move to Chile. There was no reason for me to do that. And, to me, there's a lot to be said for just kind of following your gut. Because I did end up really falling in love with Chile. And had I waited for there to be a reason to do something like that, I probably would not have gone to Chile. Because a lot of times, I'm here in Spain now, and when I tell people that I learned Spanish in Chile, the almost like 95% of the time, the reaction is, why? Why would you learn Spanish in Chile? Because it's the hardest Spanish to learn. And
Why?
because there's a lot of very local words and different kind of grammatical conjugations. And also Chileans, when they speak, they're almost speaking to themselves. They don't speak as if they want to communicate. They look down and they mutter. It almost looks like they don't really want to talk to you. It looks like they're kind of just talking to themselves. So just understanding what people are saying, even if you know Spanish, is really difficult in Chile. So anyway, to get back to your question, because I learned Spanish in Chile, it's much easier for me to translate Chileans, obviously. When I'm reading, the Spanish that I hear tends to be Chilean. And it has to do, I hear the music of a Chilean text in a way that I don't when I read a Spanish text. You're right. I feel more sure of myself when I translate Chilean writers, which is not to say that I feel sure of myself, but more so. I think that one thing that working with Alejandro has done is that, Alejandro is very aware of language also. He writes in Chilean. Now that he lives in Mexico, he's maybe even more aware of, specific words and the differences among Spanishes. And he plays with that a lot. And I think that when I'm translating, as time has gone by, I've gotten more playful with my approach to translation. So, you know, you think about what are the words that you really need in order to convey the music or the meaning or both things. And sometimes it's, 5 English words to convey one Spanish word. And Chilean Spanish I do think of as being pretty playful and musical. And so those are things that I try and focus on in the translations.
I feel like the fact that the degree of difficulty in learning Spanish in Chile is maybe higher than it is in other Spanish-speaking countries makes it the perfect place for a translator to
Yeah.
learn Spanish, right? And I'm curious to know, in your study of language, you obviously have an aptitude for it. Some people are really good with languages and can learn at a much faster pace than others. But to get to the degree of proficiency that would allow you to translate a work of literature with authority and accuracy and specificity, how long did it take you to get to a place where you felt some degree of confidence in attempting that?
I mean, okay. I would not say that this is going to sound weird, but I don't actually think that I have an aptitude for languages. I have tried to learn others, and I'm like, I can't, I haven't been able to learn Portuguese. I haven't been able to learn German. I lived in Switzerland for 5 years and I couldn't learn German. There was just something at that point in my life where the most important thing for me was to know Spanish. And so that's what I did. I'm kind of more of a dork about language than someone who has an aptitude for it. Like, there was a moment where all I wanted to do was sit there with my grammar book and conjugate verbs. I really just wanted to know it. And, my language learning style has to do with reading and writing. I have other friends who learn by speaking and listening, and they speak like a Chilean, whereas I speak like probably someone who learned from books. But it is something that I'm really interested in. And I guess you could say that after maybe 5 years, I was at the point where I could try a translation, if you want to put a number on it. But at the same time, ever since my translation style, if we can talk about such a thing, has changed over all of this time, and it will continue to change. And, when I go back and look at those early translations I did, and I've done this, like, Alejandro's books have been reissued. So I went back to that edition of the Private Lives of Trees and kind of reworked it. And it's interesting because I did make a lot of changes. I just read it in a different way now. But then there were other things that I thought, oh, well, this isn't right. Maybe I should change it. And then I would go through the whole circle to get back to the solution that, Megan from 10 years ago got to, so she wasn't all off. Like, she made some good solutions. She made some good decisions. And I think that one maybe misconception that people have about translation is that you have to be fluent, like a 100% bilingual fluent speaker of the language. And that's not true necessarily. Obviously you have to have a pretty good grasp of English, in my case, whatever language you're translating into. And you have to be a pretty good writer of that. And you also have to be a good reader because, I think that what I do is just read a lot. Like, I read and go back over the translations and I question the decisions that I've made. And I think if there were a quote unquote secret, that's it.
That makes sense. And as you were talking, I mean, this feels kind of elemental. And I think something I do often on this show is I will come to understand something very simple and elemental and then present it to my audience as though I've had an incredible epiphany. But the idea that a translator who is really good at her job would, as a necessity, be an enthusiastic and careful reader of literature and a gifted writer in her own right. That seems like the difference between a work of literature that I read that is beautifully translated and a work that is unsatisfying. Like, if I were trying to parse the difference, like, why is this book so badly translated? I've asked myself that question. It might be that the translator is, clearly fluent or close to fluent in the language, obviously, that they're reading from, but they might not be all that interested in literature. or all that good of a writer.
Yeah, and also there are different strategies of translation. You know, some people who have a more academic approach to translation where they prize things like word order or what you can maybe call literalness, you know, where you it's like a transposition, this word is this word, and you know, and they prize this reflection of the original text. And there are people who really go to bat for that. You know, they really want to reflect the syntax of the original. Um and there are probably some places for that, like in academic scenes or scenarios. But for me, the thing that I think about the most is the experience of reading. That I think is what you're talking about. Like if you prize the literature and if you prize well, if you prize the experience and you think about if you think about what a reader is going to get out of a text and how they're going to go through it. Like what I read, obviously, and this is not obvious, but maybe it's going to sound obvious. I read a book before I translate it. And then when I'm translating it, I kind of try and recreate the experience that I had as a reader.
Yeah, I recoil from this originalist interpretation of translation. I mean, maybe there's a place for it, like you say, in academia, but as an author myself, if I were to be translated, I would want to be translated by somebody who did not have that kind of strict fidelity to syntax. That doesn't seem to be the way. It's all about creating, like you say, a good reading experience in
Yeah.
English or in whatever language for the person who picks up the book. And it was interesting, Megan, to hear you talk about yourself and to sort of characterize yourself as somebody who is not like blessed with like this heightened aptitude for language. Like you don't see
No.
yourself in that way. And it is interesting too, as I heard you say that, to consider an assessment you made of Alejandro and his approach to literature in the introduction that you wrote to my documents, where you say, quote, Zambra, like many great writers, I suspect, is a person for whom language is a problem. And Alejandro, I'd love to hear you respond to that diagnosis, if I could put it that way. Do you feel like you have a problem with language? Is language something that you struggle with? And is that why you think you might be drawn to it rather than you are a person who has mastery over language or some heightened aptitude for it? Like, how do you view yourself?
I think it is a problem I love. You know, I think all those problems are there for facing them and loving them and and the position is the position of answering questions and there is a movement that I do enjoy, even if there is an unquietness, if there is if there is something I struggle with, you know, and and I think that happens in every level, you know, even the style, you know, even if we are talking about a very local problem, even if we are talking in the sentence level, you know, there is something I want to solve up, and but there is something you could enjoy, but you get to the point where you don't really know what you're doing. Maybe when we talk about our work publicly, we are not that honest because we are always talking about subjects, about purposes. But what you really enjoy is that you have a plan and you sit in front of the computer and you get to the point where you don't know what you're doing. And it's like okay, like you're playing the instrument, you're playing the guitar. So that means you learned in the past to play the guitar. So now you are able to improvise. But there is a moment where you are really part of the instrument, and that is writing for me, and it has a it has to do with the writing, not with the showing, you know. So maybe when we are in front of a camera, we are always confusing writing with the publishing, you know. It's totally different. But I
Yeah.
have to say about Megan's answer that obviously she's so talented, she's so gifted, you know, with language. Uh, but she works really like a writer, you know. This book, my documents, or the private lives of trees, the retranslations, you cannot imagine how many changes she made. It was really like she was rewriting those books. She was re thinking every sentence she had already translated in the past. So that's why I think she really works creatively. So this idea of translation as a very automatic process really doesn't apply to 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 the way a literary translator like her work, you know. So I forgot your question,
No,
but
but I have a question. I want to interject and ask a question of both of you regarding process. And Megan, I think you have a thought. Do you have a thought before I get there?
Kind of. When I said that about language being a problem for Alejandro and for great writers, what I was thinking of is like, so I translated another writer named Samantha Schweblin, and she, when she was a child, for a year or two of her life, she just stopped speaking and was mute. And she says now that it was because words just didn't say what she wanted them to say. Like she just didn't have the words, so she just decided to stop speaking. And it's something like that I think writers that drives you to write a story or a book that says the things that words themselves don't say, if that makes sense. And I think that's a concern for Alejandro too. And when I talked, when he with the word padrastro and Chilean poet, and with many other there's the story in here that is where characters write letters to make concrete changes in the world. I think Alejandro has a concern with how words can change reality and how we can use words to change their meanings. He has in the book that we're finishing now, childish literature. There's a story called Garabatos that's cuss words, and literally it's not called that in English, but it starts out with like a string of curse words that one child is writing to another. And it's funny. And then at the end of the story, it ends with another string of curse words. But by the time you get to the end of the story, those curse words have a totally different meaning. They're expressions of tenderness. And, you know, so that's what I was trying to get at, that when you're frustrated with words, when you don't have the words to say what you want to say, or when words don't say what you mean, then you have to write about it, or you have to write a story to inspire that emotion or feeling.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that writers, I mean, this has been my experience. Alejandro, I imagine it's probably the same for you, is that you're not often setting out to write a work of fiction based on mastery over a set of events or some thematic concern. you're often writing about it because you're deeply confused by it. Like
Yes.
writing is an exercise in trying to articulate your confusion.
Yeah, I think to me, words and writing has always been a way of understanding, and at the same time, a game. You know, there's no room for, it's not sadness or joy. You know, it is more. I know I was really lucky when I was a kid because I had this grandmother that was always telling us, write, you should write, you should keep a diary, you should keep a diary, you should show your feelings, write about your feelings. And
Was this the grandmother who survived the earthquake?
yes, 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 my mother's mother, and she was the most funny person. I think she was the only funny person we had around, and it was a very hard time. It was a dictatorship, and adults were always serious and were not interested in us, in kids. Kids were not important. We were not important, but for her we were very important. And she knew we were struggling with things. She wasn't a literary person. I grew up in a house without books. Uh, she was a literary personality, but I never saw her with a book, reading a book. She liked it to write. She was singing the whole time, and she was telling us, "You should write. You should write." So writing for me from the very beginning was a game. It was associated to playfulness, and at the same time was a habit. Is that the right word, Megan?
Yeah.
Habit. It was
Yes.
a habit, and I think writing is still the same to me. So, as you say, whenever I have to solve something up, I write, but at the same time, it 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 continues being a game.
I
So
think
it's a
that
habit and a game. So the most the greatest thing that has happened to me uh, has been that, that writing is those two things, a habit and a game.
well, I think that's the secret to your success, and I think it's the secret to the success of probably any artist. Because but I think that there are writers who publish for whom it is less of a game and maybe even less of a habit and more of some sort of duty or feeling of responsibility or compulsion. And I think the work suffers because of it. What I love about reading your work is, I think, precisely the feeling that there is a mind at play on the page. And Megan, I'm sure you recognize this
Mhm.
in translation. But there are a lot of things that you do, Alejandro, linguistically that are tricky to do well because there are informalities. There are moments when the text becomes self-referential. It sort of calls itself out as a story, or the narrator will sort of stop time. I'm trying to think. It's hard to immediately grab like a specific instance, but there is that. And the fact that that exists across this collection and across your body of work, that squares with what you were saying earlier about improvisation and that feeling of departure from some sort of plan or outline that you may start with. You may have some idea of what you're going to do, but then when you actually sit down to write, you begin to improvise. And I can really feel that happening on the page in your work. And I think I find that is often a characteristic of the work that I love the most. It has an energy to it that you can't really achieve and a sense of fun that you can't really achieve with a more formal approach, or it's harder at least. Megan, like I'm imagining that's part of what you responded to in his work as a reader first and foremost, but also maybe as a translator.
Yes, that is true. I think when I first read Alejandro's work, I felt a connection to it. I felt like if I were a writer, this is the kind of thing I would want to write. This kind of text that is deceptively simple, but that has layers that you can read over and over again and discover new things every time you read it. Sometimes I think the feeling of improvisation might come from a lot of work, but I could be wrong about that. I think like with facsimile or multiple choice, it's a book that is very playful and that gives the impression that you're playing with language. And I think that, but it's also a book where each word counts and nothing is extraneous. And I think that takes a lot of maybe more pruning than anything else. And it's also there. I think with the playfulness also comes. There can also be a bite, like with multiple choice. There's kind of a sharp edge to it. But I've also learned from like, well, I probably shouldn't go into this, but the whole idea that we have to use the words that we have, that is in Chilean poet, is something that I go back to a lot when I'm translating. Like sometimes when you come up against something that people say, "Oh, this is untranslatable," this is impossible to translate. I just think, no, it's not. There's a way to translate it. You just have to, use the words that we have, and maybe they're not obvious, but they're there.
So when you guys are working together, uh, I'm imagining that you take the text, Megan, and you go off and begin the sort of solitary, quiet work of translating. But I'm also imagining, in particular, because you guys are friends, in addition to being professional collaborators, I'm imagining that there is some sort of dialogue between the two of you as you set about to do the translation. Are you guys communicating with one another? Are you asking Alejandro questions? Alejandro, are you weighing in on choices that she might be making in the translation if you feel strongly that it's not accurate? Like, what does that part of it look like?
And this is something that I feel very lucky about. I read drafts of Alejandro's work as he's working on it. So that is the first thing that makes me feel kind of more invested and involved in the process. And, we are in contact a lot. So as I'm translating, sometimes I will just, send Alejandro a message on WhatsApp and ask him to explain stuff. But I do try to be more systematic about it when I get drafts and I read it through and I, come up with my questions, and then I'll send them to Alejandro. When I was working on Chilean Poet, I would do a chapter at a time and then send Alejandro a chapter with my questions, and he would read it through and respond to questions and ask his own. And that to me is really useful. I think Alejandro is my only writer who actually reads my translations. And I like it when people ask me questions, when they say, this is what I'm trying to do here, because I ask a lot of questions. My whole thing is that I don't just want to understand the words on the page. I want to know what was in the writer's head when they were working on it, which obviously is impossible. But that's the platonic ideal of translation, right? So I ask questions. Sometimes they're stupid questions and sometimes they're totally misguided. And other times the answer is not at all what I expected, and it takes me in a different direction. But also a lot of times just hearing Alejandro talk about something, it makes me feel like I can move around in the text in a different way. So I feel really lucky just that I can do that I can ask those questions, and it makes me feel like the translation can only get better.
But it's not the common scenario to have an author with whom you were in that close of contact. it's the platonic ideal, like you said, but it doesn't always work out that way. I can imagine there are instances where the translator and the author barely speak.
There are those instances, yeah.
So, Alejandro, what about your perspective on this?
Well, there are many levels I could answer that question, but basically, I think this is all about the friendship. I think I could be dead, and the book, the translation would be very similar. Uh, if we talk, is because we're friends, and we are really, really close friends. I mean, we become really close. Uh, if I show her manuscripts, or what's
Yeah.
the word, the usual word,
Draft.
drafts, uh, in Spanish, is not because of the translation. It's because she's a great reader of those drafts in Spanish. It's not because of the translation. And well, with the last book, the one that is going to be out in October, childish literature, well, there were things that I wrote uh, in Spanish, obviously, that were published, originally published in English. It's messy, but in the New York Times magazine, two of them. So the first publication was in English, two essays, one essay and a short story. So in that case, the draft was really like a weird, because the original was in English, but it wasn't the original. So nobody read the original, but Megan. So it was a weird situation. And then there was an original, but a year later. But I think it's all about the friendship. And sometimes, well, we do speak a lot, and she asks me many things. But sometimes we should record those questions, because sometimes they are really funny. It's not about the word, for example. It's about the character. It's about like but it's not about the personality of a character. It's about I don't know. Do you think this character might eat spaghetti with pesto, or do you think she's a vegetarian? So that has nothing to do with the story. But in a way, if you think about it, there is something that knowing whether she is a vegetarian or not would relate uh,
Sure.
in a very, very wide sense of what the character is doing there. Uh, might work. I mean, she wants to know. So my answer obviously is I don't know. Let's find out. So I start thinking whether this character I created might be a vegetarian or not. So I mean, Megan now has some experience with dead authors. At first, you were all of living authors. I think it's all about the friendship, and I don't I really respect the translator's work.
Yes.
I really know I'm not a native speaker of English. I mean, I am sure there are many authors that don't are not aware of that. Uh, we used to talk about this. For example, I see the parts of the words. For example, if I say the word, I love the word you have for nostalgia, homesick. I love that word. But the reason I love that word is because I see the word home, and I see the word sick, and I see those words colliding. there. Homesick. Wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And I know you don't see those
Yeah.
words when you say homesick. You don't see home and sick, but I do see those words. So that's why I love saying homesick. When I speak English, when I was living in New York, obviously my English changed, and so I started having my own English and my own words and my favorite words. But still, I was seeing words into words, you know. So I still was so happy when I was saying like homesickness.
Yeah.
Wow, I
Yeah.
feel, and same thing happens in if you speak Spanish for example as a second language. You say soledad. Maybe you see sol, sun, edad, age.
No.
But if you say soledad in Spanish, you don't see those words. You don't see those words at all. The soledad. So it's like a false way of seeing the word because it has nothing to do with the origin of that word. You know, soledad has nothing to do with sun. It has nothing to do with edad, with age. Uh, but so that's why I my I think my usual question for Megan has to do with that. You know, uh, sometimes I feel, for example, something about a word, and I say, well, I'm not a native, so I think that this word maybe doesn't mean what I think it means. You know, so it's more like a that approach, and the answer is like 99% of the cases is like, don't worry, it does mean what
Well, but
you
I
know
think I
what
think I think what you're talking about as an issue of translation is that sometimes there are not like real direct corollaries for a
Right.
word or a turn of phrase. And that is where a translator's job, I think, might become extra important, because what you're talking about in that case is not a matter of translation alone, but a matter of translation and also taste.
Mm.
Like if you have good taste in word choice, if there's not a direct or obvious corollary,
Mm.
it's
yeah
going to make
plus what you were saying, what we were talking about Chilean Spanish, well, naturally you wouldn't say like this is translated from Chilean Spanish to English, but it is.
Mm.
You know, there are many slight, tiny differences that are there in Megan's translation. Because if you have this very, 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 very interesting big language like Spanish that is spoken in many, many, many different ways, many translators just play the standard, you know? You just need to know that this word is a local uh, word that could be translated as a standard, you know? Megan does not do that. Doesn't do
Yeah.
that. No, she doesn't do that. She tries to 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 play with the nuances.
I can give you an
You
example
know?
if you want.
sure, yeah, please.
So there's in Chilean Poet, there's a scene between two of the young poets,
And
and
just for people listening, I want to interrupt. Chilean Poet is another book by Alejandro.
right. Sorry, we were supposed to talk about my documents. Well,
But yeah, no, it's
so
fine.
I'm
I
just
just
going to
want to
talk
make sure
about
people.
one word.
Yeah.
So there's a Chilean word that is ciútico, which is really only used in Chile, and it has a very specific word that Alejandro can maybe go more into this. But when someone says something is ciútico or someone is ciútico, it means that they are kind of like they want to seem like fancier than they are. They want to create an impression of themselves as rich or cultured. And it's a word that's used kind of a lot in Chile. Anyway, so there's one scene in Chilean Poet where one character listens to another one talk and thinks, "Oh, he seems ciútico," and the translation I translated it as he's a name dropping social climbing wannabe. So 3 composite words to kind of explain one. And it's playful and it fits with the voice of the character. I think there are many other instances when you would use the word ciútico where you wouldn't translate it that way, but it fits with the context and it fits with the character, and in that instance it works. But I think that's an example of, people ask me all the time, like, how do you translate the word weon, which is probably the most common used word in Chilean slang, and it means a million things in Chile. So when they ask me, how do you translate that? There are many different ways that you translate it. It depends on the voice and it depends on the instance and how it's being used in that particular instance.
What does it mean?
So,
What are some general meanings for what is it called? Weon? What's the word?
well, yeah. So it can be an adjective, it can be a noun, it can be a verb. So it can really mean anything. It can be an insult or it can be like a term of endearment. So if you call someone a weon and you're angry, you could be an asshole. Or if you call someone weon and you're friends, it could just be like dude or man.
This is a
You
very
know,
utilitarian word. This is a useful
wea
word.
could be a thing. Huevear could be mess with. It can be used a lot of different ways. So I've probably translated it a good 20 or 30 different words. So the point is that people have the ideas, like the idea that there's like this word has a translation, but a lot of times that's not true.
All right. Well, I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about my documents in particular. And there is something that is said again, I believe, in the introduction to the book, where you say, Megan, quote, Zambra's self-examination through fiction, one might say, reached a critical point in my documents. And you also say, I remember feeling that Alejandro's book of short stories, ironically, gave him more room to spread out than his novels. So the books that preceded my documents, these were novellas. It's hard to characterize these things, but let's just say slender novels. So not super long form, but longer than a short story. And yet you say the feeling of reading these short stories is that there was more room creatively for him to move around. What did you mean by that?
Well, first of all, just very simply, the book is longer than his first 2 books, which were novels. And I think it was maybe a little longer or about the same length as Ways of Going Home. So there's that, but then there's also just the voices in this book cover a lot of ground. There's the first story, which is autobiographical, and then there are other voices that, to me, and I could be wrong about this, Alejandro can say what he thinks, but there are some voices in here, like in Thank You, or maybe The Most Chilean Man in the World, where there's a different style for the first time that is kind of it's a more oral style and more of a run-on. It's more of a voice that talks and doesn't let up, if that makes sense. Where
It
you're telling a
does, yeah.
story and there's not a good place to stop. It kind of pulls you forward. Whereas in other stories, there's there are some that are kind of diary entries or almost aphoristic, where there's a lot of space and you stop in between different ideas. So if you think of the diary style, the aphoristic style, the run-on style, and then there are some other stories that are kind of maybe a little bit more structured more traditionally, like Camilo.
Ugh. Camille, that's a heartbreaking story.
Yeah, Yes, it is. It really is. And so to me, when I said what I mean is that there's room for a multiplicity of styles and a multiplicity of voices in one book. Which, as soon as I say something like that, I start questioning it because, Ways of Going Home also has a multiplicity of voices, and, it plays with style and, tells one story from multiple points of view. So everything I say, there's also a caveat and there's another side to it. But that's just a sense that I had.
No, but I have to thank Brad and Megan for these nice things you've said about my work. You know, I think I should thank you. I'm just hearing you. You know, I have to thank you. I agree. But I'm the worst person to talk about my own work. I feel like every book is so different to the other. You know, but I do think my documents that was a book I originally published in 2013, so it has 11 years. Was a book where I started to change and I started to try different things. For example, I feel like the narrator of Chilean poet. That is a book from 2020. Started to exist in some stories of my documents. I feel it's the same oral style. I started to rely more on music, and that started to happen. I think in some stories here, like The Most Chilean Man of the World, or Thank You, like Megan was saying. And I think that for example, there are stories here that in a way I would keep on writing, like National Institute, for example. I think that is a book that I would continue writing in a way, uh, or I did. I mean, there is a story in Multiple Choice that in a way could be in the same book with National
Well,
Institute.
can I interrupt? Because I have a question about National
Yes.
Institute. There's a line that I read in a review of my documents. I believe that's where I'm pulling it from, where the critic says, quote, Zambra is acknowledging and stress testing the line between fiction and personal history, memory and story. And it isn't only his narrators who are in on it. And that was certainly my sense in reading my documents, that there was this kind of play between personal history and fiction, and you taking things from your own childhood, your own life, and kind of twisting them into a short story. And as I was reading National Institute, the narrator of that story, I believe it's a first person narrator.
Yeah, it's four parts. So I think one part is on the third
Right.
person, and I don't remember well,
but I know from poking around a little bit that you yourself attended the National Institute in your youth. So of course I'm thinking to myself, oh, this is drawn from life. But there is a line from, I believe, the narrator where he says there is a teacher at school who wrote a Henry Miller quote on the chalkboard that changed my life. So I had to write this down. I was like, did this really happen to you? And if so, what was the quote? If it changed your life, let me know.
The first lines of Black Spring. I don't know the lines in English.
Oh, okay. But it's the first lines of Black Spring. We can all go look this up,
Yeah.
you know.
In Spanish is lo que no está en medio de la calle es falso, derivado. Es decir, literatura. So beautiful.
So what's not in the middle of the street is false. That it
derivative.
False and derivative. That is literature.
Yeah,
but I'm sure it's
that
It's like
different.
it's a line against
Mhm.
literature that this teacher, Ricardo Ferrada, a teacher who is dedicated to multiple choice,
wait, you
use.
dedicated multiple choice to him.
Yeah, to four teachers. As it is a parodic book, some people thought I was dedicating this book to teachers I hated, but not for teachers I loved. And but this teacher, I'm still friends with this teacher. But the first class, this teacher put that quote by Henry Miller, and it's a line in a way against literature, you know,
What can we
or
repeat it again and translate it again just because I wanna make sure everybody listening.
maybe we could quickly Google it because it's the first lines of Black Spring.
Alright, so I found it. And the opening lines of Henry Miller's Black Spring read, "What is not in the open street is false, derived. That is to say, literature."
Yeah,
We were close.
We were close.
but it is against
Yeah.
literature in a way, you know.
And so maybe there is an impulse in you creatively to try to, in your books, bridge the
Yeah.
divide and to
Yeah, in a way, it's a paradox, you know. It's a literature against literature, and if it is an idea that, in a way, I I've been faithful to. I mean, especially in my essays, no? Not to read.
Hmm.
But you know, this teacher wasn't like a Mr. Keating or something. He was very shy. Uh, he was very original. The first book we read with him, we were not that young. We were 16. We were not 12. The first book we read with him, with him was Alice in the
Oh.
Wonderland. You know, so we were all complaining like, "Oh, this is for kids," you know.
like the Alice in
But
Wonderland by,
yeah, yeah,
Lewis Carroll.
yeah, Lewis Carroll. And then we read Ezra Pound, and then we read Manuel Rojas, Chilean novelist. So it was very, very special the way we were educated by him. But he wasn't like shouting, "You should read this way or that way." And there were those tiny gestures, like putting this sentence there. But I'm glad that you asked. It is not a secret, you know. It's coqueteria. What's the word for
It's like
coqueteria?
a
I forgot it.
it's like a it's coy, it's flirtatious, it's
Yeah, yeah.
a wink
But
at the
Well, I mean,
audience.
the fact that you didn't mention the line itself, I was
Yeah.
like, "Okay, come on."
yeah. So it is a beautiful reference. But well, with my documents, I have that feeling that every story is very different. Stories are very different one each other, and I feel like um, I don't think that books of short stories are only like um, I don't know how to say this in English. Like it's not like accumulating things. It's not an accident. It's not like you were writing short stories and you put all those stories together. It is more like you are lucky to be like 11 writers, different writers. So there are many things in common, and you have this first story that is uh, like totally nonfiction, I would say, and this whole range of different things. Some of them very painful, some of them lighter, some of them really hard to classify. And I think all are related to masculinity and a way of conceiving the possibility of belonging and to that. The idea of rejection and belonging, and trying to find out to go farther, you know. But every story is a separate world, and at the same time collides with the other. I mean, so when I was writing them, I wrote, as always. This is connected with what we were talking before about improvisation. I mean, I write a lot. I know it sounds stupid saying it that way, but I write a lot. I just write a lot, and I forget about publishing. And naturally, when you decide to publish, well, you make decisions. But you have 25 stories, and you choose 11. You know, so in a way, in that moment, you are creating something you are going to show. But when I write, I just write, and naturally we are against time. That's the big battle. We are fighting against time. That's the dictatorship we are always fighting against. You know, we don't have time. We are unhappy because of that. And writing is demanding, and we are struggling with it. You know, but I try to create uh, as many moments of freedom in my life as possible. You know? Now, as a father, I'm really clear. You know, raising my kid and writing. You know, that's all I care about, and the way I live is totally focused on on that. I have the time of fatherhood and the time of writer, and I want those words to be in total harmony, and I enjoy that a lot because I feel those two those experiences are connected, and time happens in a similar way. You know, when you're playing with your kid, when you're writing, time happens in a similar way.
Well, you're
You
playing in
know?
both instances.
Yes. And that's obviously hard to defend. You know, because work is also sometimes doing other things. But if you have I'm happy enough to have like my 3 or 4 hours of writing, and 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 that's great.
Yeah, and I mean, if you can manage it to sit down to write and to divorce yourself from any thought of publishing and to just get lost in the process and to be deeply focused and to play on the page and to follow your characters into the story in a way that is immersive and emotionally involved, the results are probably going to be good. It's hard to do, but it sounds like you had, like you said, that training from childhood where your grandmother really instilled in you this sense of play around storytelling and around self-expression. That's such a valuable gift that I'm not sure most writers can access easily. And I think that's a good place to wrap up. There's so much to talk about with my documents. I mean, we could it contains multitudes, as Megan said, and there are so many different things we could explore in conversation about it. But the best thing really to do is to read it. It is a wonderful collection. And I got to say, I'm sort of jealous of this thing that you guys have going. I hope one day I have a translator who gets me as well as Megan seems to get you, Alejandro. And I deeply appreciate both of you making time to speak with me and to have this conversation. It is the kind of conversation, as I was telling you, I think before we came on the air, that I have been meaning to have on this show for a long time, where I speak with a translator, and to get to speak with a translator as well as the person whom she translates is like extra good. So thank you both.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
All right, you guys, there we go. That was my conversation with Alejandro Zambra and Megan McDowell. Alejandro's story collection is called My Documents, available now in a new edition in the United States from Penguin. It is the official April pick of the Otherppl Book Club, translated by Megan McDowell. Alejandro can be found on the internet on Instagram, I believe. Megan is at meganmcdowelltranslation.com. You can also follow her on social media on Twitter and Instagram. Once again, the book is called My Documents, a story collection by Alejandro Zambra, translated by Megan McDowell. Go get your copy immediately. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen. It's free. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow the show on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. Sign up for my weekly email newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. Join the Otherppl Patreon community over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this show going into the future. If you have 2 minutes and you want to help me out a little bit, please give this show a rating wherever you listen. Write a little review. If you want to join the Otherppl Book Club or get an Otherppl t-shirt, you can do both of those things at otherppl.com. I have a novel out. It is called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. It is my latest book, available now in trade paperback, ebook, and audiobook editions. I narrate the audiobook. So if you want to read my book or have me read it to you, that is an option. Once again, it is a novel called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. Okay, so coming up on Wednesday, there will be a new Craftwork episode all about the power of names in life and in writing. A fascinating conversation with Ethel Rowan, author of a new novel called Sing I. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned.